Our world is changing. Our climate is obviously a major factor.
Andrew Constance was a memorable face of the cataclysmic 2019 bushfires which ravaged Australia's east coast, including his own region and hometown on the New South Wales south coast. Like many others, he battled to save his own home. The experience had a profound impact on him. He told the Sydney Morning Herald in 2020,
I'm going to dedicate the rest of my life to making sure this doesn't happen again.
He remained passionate about the impact of climate change 2 years later.
Well, I mean, look, I think climate policy in Australia is wrong. We were impacted by one of the largest global events when it comes to climate change. You know, it costs lives, it costs property. Our politics is so polarising, it's absurd.
At the time of the fires, Andrew Constance was the New South Wales Transport Minister. Now he's the federal Liberal candidate for the seat of Gilmore. But his views on climate change, or at least what you do about it, seem to have changed.
In terms of our international obligations, they're one thing. But don't sell us out as you do it. 2035 Paris Agreement target off the table by the Liberal Party.
Andrew Constance's suggestion that Australia should walk away from the Paris Climate Agreement contradicts Peter Dutton's statements on the issue.
We've entered into an international agreement, and I believe that when we do that, we should honour the agreement.
Shadow Climate Change Minister Ted O'Brien told 7:30 this afternoon that the Coalition's policy on Paris remained unchanged. Mr Constance said the Coalition position has been clearly articulated by Peter Dutton. This apparent contradiction is just one sign of how the Coalition's climate change position and nuclear policy have been a little confused while everyone has been distracted by other things. Some of the tensions around the policy have come to a head as a result of a bitter battle with one of their own in the past 24 hours.
Well, it was disappointing to see those comments from Mr Constance. I was in the party room when the then Minister Constance voted for the Coalition Government's renewable energy policies, which have been the foundation for the current Labor Government's renewable energy policies. So I'm not sure why Mr Constance has chosen this moment to be the face of nuclear energy. He has previously said he was committed to preserving our planet and taking action on climate change. Now he wants to be the face of climate denial.
Matt Keane was a Cabinet Minister in the same New South Wales Liberal government as Andrew Constance, and as State Treasurer, Environment and Energy Minister, was a major supporter of measures to tackle climate change. Last year, the Albanese government appointed him to head the Climate Change Authority, an independent body with a mandate to advise governments on policies around climate change and the country's emissions. Yesterday, the Climate Change Authority and Keane raised the climate change policy temperature on the federal coalition.
Well, the role of the Climate Change Authority, as outlined in the Climate Authority Act, is to provide frank and fearless advice on policies that will have an impact on carbon emissions and climate change.
The Climate Change Authority released new analysis which forecasts that pursuing nuclear energy in Australia could see us miss the legislated 43% emissions reduction target for 2030 by 5 percentage points and still not achieve this level of reduction by 2035 because we would have to rely on coal for longer.
We modelled the nuclear pathway set out by the Coalition Government and the impact on emissions that will have. And we found that it will see a carbon bomb being dropped on the Australian economy. 2 billion tonnes of additional emissions that will be caused under a nuclear pathway as proposed by the Coalition opposition.
The political response from the Coalition was swift. In a statement, Shadow Minister Ted O'Brien said,
"The Climate Change Authority has sadly become a puppet of Anthony Albanese and Chris Bowen as its latest report parrots Labor's untruthful anti-nuclear scare campaign."
I'm not sure why Mr O'Brien is trying to politicise the Independent Climate Authority. Our role is to provide evidence-based and science-based advice on climate policy. On a personal note, I've been a long-term advocate for protecting our environment and handing it to future generations better than we found it. And I'm not going to be bullied by political pressure.
But the dispute has raised more questions. In his statement, Mr O'Brien also says,
"The Coalition remains committed to a net zero electricity grid by 2050, and not only will our plan for a balanced energy mix of renewables, nuclear and gas deliver net zero sooner than Labor's renewables only plan, but at a cost which is 44% cheaper."
I think Mr O'Brien needs to clarify the Coalition's position. Previously, they've said they're committed to net zero emissions by 2050 for the whole economy. But yesterday, Mr O'Brien seemed to walk that back and say that they're only committed to net zero emissions in the electricity sector. Now, that's important because emissions from the electricity sector are only 35% of our total emissions.
Note that Mr O'Brien says the Coalition remains committed to a net zero electricity grid, not net zero. 7:30 sought clarification from Mr O'Brien. He responded that the Coalition remains committed to Paris and net zero by 2050. The Coalition has regularly defended its position on climate change by arguing that the government has not outlined the 2035 emissions reduction targets that Australia must make to comply with the Paris Agreement. This is true, and it would be reasonable to say that in a political environment where the government is trying to minimise the issues on which it can be targeted, there would be lots of political reasons for them to delay announcing those targets. But the technical reasons it gives is that the targets come from Keen's Climate Change Authority, and that target has not yet been set.
My responsibility is to provide advice in the national interest on what Australia's best pathway is for 2035. Obviously, the world has changed dramatically since I've come into this role. With the election of Donald Trump, I don't think I need to tell your viewers that things are different. Just ask Vladimir Zelensky if the world is a different place.
Mr O'Brien told 7:30 that Labor had promised to release its 2035 target no later than this month, but now they want to keep it a secret until well after the election. He said the Coalition, quote, won't follow Labor's folly of plucking a number out of thin air, and that the emissions reduction targets that the Coalition sets from government will consider the impact on the economy, the trajectory of emissions and its own policies. To summarise the various threads of the Coalition's climate policy, according to a Liberal Party candidate with a passionate interest in climate change, the Coalition will walk away from the Paris Agreement and therefore a 2035 emissions reduction target if elected. Further, the Coalition's spokesman on climate and energy is using language that refers to net zero electricity emissions, and the Coalition says it will shoot the climate change messenger by sacking Keen as head of the authority if it wins office. As a reminder of the questions that continue to circulate about the policy, we note the comments of Queensland LNP Senator Matt Canavan last year.
But we're latching onto it as a silver bullet, as a panacea, because it fixes a political issue for us, that it's low emission and it's reliable. But it ain't the cheapest form of power.